What's up, brothers? Welcome back to Securely Wired. My name is Sydney Fox, and I am an evolution student and a preschool teacher. And today, we're going to be talking about the evolutionary advantages and disadvantages of attachment styles in human beings. I wanted to talk about this today because attachment style theory is something that is really, really important to my work. As a preschool teacher, a lot of my job is forming secure attachments to the children in my class. And attachment style, which I'll describe a little bit later, it's something that's formed almost immediately. It starts immediately at birth, and then, it sort of follows you through the rest of your life. So with my older kids, this is a little bit more of a difficult task. But attachment is really important when we're talking about helping raise young kids. So how this is going to work is that today we're going to start by talking about what attachment style theory is. I'm going to give a really, really rough, brief intro for those of you who don't know. And then we're going to have a special guest come talk to us about what that means in depth, especially in her field of work. And then I'm going to kind of give the rest of the time to talk about what are the evolutionary advantages and disadvantages of attachment style. So for a really quick explanation, essentially, attachment style theory is a theory proposed by two super well-known researchers, Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby, and this is in the 1970s. And basically this theory is all about the attachment and bond that forms between an infant and its caregivers, which is sometimes not mom and dad, so I will probably be using the term caregiver mostly throughout the rest of this pod. So I'm going to kind of let our special guest get a little more in depth on what that means and what all that is. But that's basically a really brief intro to attachment style theory. So to introduce our special guest today, our special guest is Tawny Parrish. She is a human development and family studies PhD student, and she is, in my mind, the resident expert of attachment style theory. Tawny knows so much about it, and she has been really, really instrumental in helping me plan for this podcast. She helped me find primary literature and basically write my whole outline for this. So thank you so much, Tawny. We're really excited to have you.
Hello, I'm Tawny. Thanks for having me, Sid.
Of course. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
So today we're talking about attachment theory and evolution, but you are, in my mind, the expert on attachment theory. At least that I know, because you have taught me everything I know about attachment theory. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about attachment theory. We'll discuss. It's totally informal, but what is attachment theory?
Yeah, so attachment theory has a pretty lengthy history if you really go into it. Like you talked about, it started with Ainsworth and Bowlby in the 70s, and that was a pretty interesting time in research because we were starting, especially social science research, because we were starting to get a lot more innovative in methodologies. Mary Ainsworth, kind of a girl boss, honestly.
Yeah.
She brought this new method to the table where she was using observational data experimentally. That's kind of one of the reasons that the theory took off the way it did, was because we were finding things that had never been found before because we didn't have that type of innovative scientific style. And so I respect her a lot for that, but we'll talk about the shortcomings of the theory later. But yeah, so that observational method she used in what she called the strange situation test. And this is kind of one of the most prominent tenets of the theory, I would say, especially because it kind of permeated into the general public rather than just staying in like that social science realm. You can talk about attachment these days and odds are people are going to know what you're talking about, which is interesting because you don't get that all the time with theories.
Right.
Like you couldn't mention ecological theory to anybody.
Right.
With them understanding the kind of systems and things like that. So yeah, so it's unique in that way too. But essentially what she did was she brought mothers and their children into a lab setting that was set up with a bunch of toys. And she had a stranger come in who was somebody on the research team. The stranger came in, and as soon as that happened, Ainsworth was observing that the babies would return to mom. They were all about one. So they would return to mom. They would kind of cease their playing. And then the mom was cued to stand up and leave the room. So she would exit, and which typically results in distress. The stranger would try to interact with the baby, would initiate play, and nothing really worked to calm the baby. It's kind of that stranger danger sense.
Especially at 1.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then what was interesting, though, was that wasn't necessarily the part that Ainsworth was interested in. She started finding patterns through the reunion process. So when mom would come back in, there were different patterns that were emerging. So in a secure attachment, which is typically said to be the healthiest for infants, which has some caveats, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
But with secure attachment, when the mom comes back into the room, she's able to instantly soothe the infant. The infant goes to the mother for comfort and receives that comfort, essentially. And then once the mother is back, the baby will typically go back to exploring or playing. And so that was actually pretty significantly the most likely outcome that she was observing. I want to say it was like 68%, somewhere in there, of infants demonstrated that kind of security. But she was also noticing anxious attachment styles, which in a kind of dichotomous black and white way is the opposite of secure attachment. And anxiously attached infants, when the mom would return, if they were anxious ambivalent, they would go to the mother seeking that comfort, but it was almost like they also wanted out of the mother's grasp. So they're pulling her close, but also pushing her away, which is pretty interesting because that's kind of, I don't know. I just, when I read that outcome, I wouldn't have thought that that is what the pattern would be.
Right.
That seems pretty cognitively complex to me. But yeah, and the mother isn't able to instantly soothe the infant. They cry for a while. They don't go back to exploring, things like that. So then you have insecure avoidant, the pattern she was observing. These babies actually typically did not cry when the mother left the room, and there was some interesting research about that later on, but they seemed to not care whether the mom was in the room or out of the room. When she came back, they were indifferent towards the mom being there. They weren't necessarily playing, but it didn't matter whether she was here or there, is what it looked like. And later experiments actually revealed that physiologically those infants are under the most stress out of the 3 attachment types. Their heart rates are extremely fast, their breathing is faster. So it's essentially this idea of, I know that you will not meet my emotional needs and you won't provide me that comfort, so demonstrating my emotions does nothing for me. And if I keep them in, I have a better chance of protecting myself. Yeah, and that's a really good example of some things that might continue with you throughout adulthood, too. Like, that's a pretty intense thing to understand at 1 year old, you know? So.
Yeah, and those are always ones that are, I don't want to say, like, necessarily more obvious, but it is more obvious in, like, a preschool setting. Those kids who immediately get dropped off and do not care.
Yeah.
Do not turn back around to see mom and dad leave, do not say goodbye, and don't cry all day, or cry at all during the day, they don't get anxious at pickup time, they're just very nonchalant about the caregiver, which is an interesting pattern for sure.
Yeah, and it can be hard to watch, I think, because it feels like something is missing, and part of that is social. We're conditioned to kind of expect that, but yeah, it's interesting for sure. Yeah, and so those are the 3 primary styles that Ainsworth observed. Obviously, there have been decades of research done since then, but yeah, those were the originals. Then a collaborative effort between Bowlby and Ainsworth resulted in this idea of what is called an internal working model. That describes the concept of the attachment experiences you have in early childhood have the potential to follow you throughout the rest of your life, and they kind of cognitively shape the way you view relationships and the way that you perceive relational communications and things like that. So that's that kind of idea of like, oh, like your past childhood experiences are going to affect your ability to, specifically romantically is typically the focus, but in order to provide romantic relationship to someone later on. And
for your own kids, if you have them later on also.
Absolutely.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, and so that part of the theory really took off and became popularized, and it's a pretty interesting kind of metacognitive social tool that kind of became more prevalent, especially through social media, I would say. Like there are all kinds of attachment quizzes, and people know about this theory for sure, and that piece of it, that internal working model, is typically the tenet they're referring to, because they want to see what their style is and how it's going to affect them, which is a pretty binary way of thinking of a theory, like you're one thing or another. And I think it kind of permeates this idea of like, oh, I'm stuck with these behaviors and there's nothing I can do about it.
For sure.
Which is not
true.
No, it's not true. It's not the best way to look at it. And Ainsworth herself has come out and said this was not the part of the theory that I wanted to become as popular as it did. I think there's a lot of worth in the other tenets, and so she was fully aware of kind of the direction that theoretical outlook was going, which is interesting too, to have that kind of foresight about it, I guess. And then the other component of attachment theory that I think is relevant is kind of what contributes to that attachment building between caregivers and their infants. Sensitive caregiving is kind of revered as the best method to form attachment with your infant. It's, if you take a training on attachment theory, they're going to be talking about sensitive caregiving,
right?
Which is basically the idea of responding to your infant in a sensitive, timely, child-centered manner. Meeting their needs to the best of your ability. And so and infants have distress signals that they put out to bring their caregivers closer, because infants are in such a vulnerable stage of life. They need constant protection from their caregiver in order to survive. They need food. They can't regulate temperature. They have no sense of homeostasis yet. All of these things. And so typically that's in the form of crying, verbalizations, things like that, babbling, all throughout until they've kind of developed the cognitive ability to speak and to have symbolic language. So sensitive caregiving is the other kind of big component of attachment.
And that's becoming more popular now. I want to say like our parents' generation and the generation before that are very much disconnected from that idea in that they like prioritized like cry it out method.
Yes.
Things like that. And so it's nice to see this sort of sensitive caregiving kind of come to the forefront again.
I know, it is. And it's funny because people are very resistant to that too. It's viewed as permissive parenting, which is not necessarily the case. And it's kind of about that initial formation of a bond. And this has been theorized since the beginning as well. I mean, before attachment, you had Erickson talking about trust versus mistrust.
Right.
Having a conceptualization of what purpose adults serve in your life and whether or not you can trust them to care for you. And that, again, sets you up for all future relationships and life events, theoretically. So it's pretty interesting and definitely something that I employ. I think that sensitivity is important for childcare providers, for caregivers, for parents.
100%.
Yeah, and that's something that's noteworthy too, is that attachment is not just between a primary caregiver and an infant, whether that be a parent or whoever the child primarily lives with. We also see attachment formations in childcare, which the majority of children are enrolled in childcare at some point in their lives in the US. So that's a pretty big kind of system that child is part of for the early years of their life, and we do see attachment formation there. There can be attachment formation with relatives. I mean, it really just depends who the baby is interacting with, and so you can form a sensitive attachment with any baby that you're consistently interacting with, which is important for professionals to kind of be aware of. So
for sure.
In the rest of the podcast, you talk about how this kind of idea of, oh, well, if your baby is anxiously attached, you screwed up. And that is also not a great way to be utilizing this theory. And when you look at the actual evolutionary backing for attachment theory, we see that that's not the case at all, and that there are advantages to each attachment style.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we see like, obviously, when we're talking about animals, of course, there's like a different component of like vigilance and predator detection and stuff that doesn't happen in humans necessarily to the same degree.
Right.
And that is really truly where those attachment styles shine, like the anxious and the avoidant. And it's interesting to think about how those evolved in a species that doesn't have to be so alert about predator detection.
Right.
Obviously, infants have alert vigilance about predator detection. That's stranger danger, you know? That is anxious vigilance to a T. So that's really interesting. And so it all just comes down to this question of like, why did we evolve these behaviors?
Right.
Which I talk about later. I go into some depth about that later. So
Right. It's not just these patterns that are coming from nowhere. They have a background that's important to account for. Yeah. So it's important to kind of be able to take a step back and look at things more objectively. And I think that evolutionary piece is so interesting because it kind of allows you to do that at a different level too. So
yeah, and I would wonder internationally what like the implications of like this class. We read a paper about pelvic style or pelvic size changing in relation to the distance you go from Africa and that migration route. And I would wonder what are the like evolutionary changes of social bonds in that same context.
Oh, that's interesting. So in the sense that like depending on where you're located, attachment looks different. Okay. And in a geographic sense or just based on like social norms?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
I would wonder what are the implications of both.
Right. I mean, because if you're living somewhere where you're facing environmental threats, for example, like, I don't know, say your infant could get eaten by a lion if left alone, that's going to look different.
Yeah, for sure.
Than walking down the street of New York City or something like that.
Right. Or like in the like cold desert climates of Antarctica or Siberia, you know, you have to, you know, there's different environmental factors that attribute to that. So I would wonder about those as well.
That is really interesting.
Well, thanks for coming on the pod.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This was great. So this was Tawny Parrish, Human Development and Family Studies PhD student, and an incredible influence on my life and my teaching philosophy. So thank you, Tawny, for coming.
Thank you for the glowing reviews.
So now I'd like to talk about the evolutionary benefits of this concept. I believe that there are 6 main reasons these attachment styles could have evolved in humans. And now these are just the reasons that I came up with. This is just the stuff that seemed to really stick out to me throughout the literature. And the first is that infants are really vulnerable. In terms of animals, human infants are born incredibly dependent on caregivers for survival. Lots of species, you know, horses walk within hours or days of being born, and other animals are born with instincts that teach them how to feed themselves and protect themselves. You know, there's some species of bird that before they even have eyesight, they're kicking other eggs out of the nest as like a means of survival. And human babies do not have any of that. So human infants are really premature in terms of physical development, can't walk, feed themselves, or most importantly, protect themselves from danger. And this is the vulnerability that means that they require this constant protection and care from adults. And the second reason that I kind of believe that this could have evolved is caregiver proximity. You know, these attachment behaviors like crying and clinging and like seeking comfort from adults are there to keep infants close to caregivers who are literally their only means of survival. And so staying as close as possible to the caregiver protects human babies from potential dangers in the environment. Obviously, human babies don't necessarily have a ton of natural predators, but the environment is a huge one. Baby birds can be left alone. Lots of baby animals can be left alone without the caregiver present, but humans, again, are not that way. And then the third, this kind of is one that was hard for me to kind of understand at first, but this is like the transmission of these caregiving patterns. So attachment styles are not only beneficial for children, but also they influence the caregiving behavior of adults. And adults who previously have had insecure or avoidant or anxious attachment can form secure bonds with their babies and, you know, kind of break this cycle of insecure attachment in their lives, which is really cool when you think about it like that. And so these caregivers who experience these secure attachments are more likely to pass on secure attachments to their children and their children's children by proxy. The next one kind of goes with that one, and this is responsive caregiving. And that basically just says that this system of attachment was designed by humans, I guess, unintentionally designed by evolution to elicit these caregiving behaviors from adults. So when the infant is displaying distress and stress and things like that, crying, fussing, it can trigger a chemical response in the caregiver to respond. And so this responsiveness ensures that the infant's needs are being met, which is really interesting. Now I'm going to pause there for a second and just say that those are the ones that I sort of was able to suss out with my own knowledge of attachment style and attachment theory. And these last two were ones that were kind of brought to my attention from the literature. And there's a couple studies that I'll cite at the end that kind of prove these as true. And so the fifth one is a secure base. And so when an infant has a secure base, a secure attachment to a caregiver, they're not insecure, they're not anxious, they're not avoidant, they have a strong bond, they are more confident and more likely to explore the environment that they are in. And this environment could be anything, you know, it could be the house, it could be, you know, the park, it could be daycare, preschool. And so this is part of why it's so important in my line of work to have a secure bond with the children in your class, is because when they feel like they have a secure bond with a caregiver that is present, they're more likely to explore. Oftentimes in preschool, we see kids who have never been in school before, and obviously they're new, they don't know you. If they're older, like 4 or 5 or 6, it can be harder for them to feel comfortable getting to know you, someone outside of the family, if they haven't really had much experience with that. And it can kind of present in the classroom as a child who is shy, not really engaging with other children, and also not really engaging with toys. You can have the coolest toys in the world, and a child who feels insecure in the environment will not explore them, which is kind of a struggle for our first day of school jitters. So that sort of formation of a secure base is really, really important in kind of like my line of work. And so I found that really interesting. And then the final reason that I could come up with for why this could have evolved is adaptability. Attachment styles are fairly adaptable. I really like to think that they are fixed in place from that first caregiver attachment. But, a child can have insecure attachments at home and secure attachments with teachers at school. Oftentimes you won't see that. You'll see like a child who has a really anxious attachment to a parent come to school and sort of transfer that to a teacher and have formed this really intense, anxious attachment to a teacher. And in preschool, that looks like a kid who only wants to play with the teacher, who doesn't want to play with other kids, only explore toys if they have the one-on-one attention of a teacher there as well. And so those are kind of easy to spot behaviors as well. So all of this is to say that attachment styles are adaptive strategies that promote the survival of infants before they have sort of that ability to take care of themselves. And humans are unique because we are not quite independent until we reach full maturity. Lots of species of animals can become independent, shortly after birth or a few years after birth, depending on the age and stage that they're in. But humans, we typically decide that they're not fully independent until reach the age of 18 or 20 or 25 or whatever. And so that's a really interesting distinction as well. And so forming these strong bonds with caregivers and developing these effective attachment behaviors helps infants increase their chances of receiving the protection that they need in order to survive, and then later in order to thrive. So we've been talking a lot about attachment and sort of talking not quite so explicitly about the evolutionary concepts that present themselves. So I just like to explicitly throw those out there, that the evolutionary concepts that apply to attachment theory. The first one that I was thinking of was really natural selection. These attachment behaviors, such as proximity seeking and caregiving, have evolved through natural selection because they increase the survival and reproductive success of the individuals. Infants who develop secure attachments are more likely to receive the care and protection that they need in order to survive. So that is natural selection. The next really big one, and I'm kind of lump some together here, is social bonds and parental investment. I really just kind of want to throw those together, as well as cooperation, because really all of this links back to the idea that attachment promotes social bonds and cooperation between caregivers and infants, and as well as between members of all the social groups. Especially in preschool, parents who have a relationship with their child's teacher are more likely to have that strong social group and that more support helping take care of their child. And then finally, and what I believe is the most obvious one of this, but possibly also the most important one to point out explicitly, is adaptation. Attachment behaviors are adaptive responses. And what I mean by that is that infants are born predisposed to needing that attachment. Every single infant forms an attachment style. Every single infant feels the need to connect with the caregiver, and they learn the attachment style from the environment, essentially. And these attachment styles, are the different adaptive strategies in order to navigate this relationship and cope with the environment. So I just like to wrap this up by saying that, attachment style theory is really, really important to the bonds that you will form in your life. I don't think anyone is inconvenienced by learning about it, because it can really affect all your relationships and, the way you potentially raise your own kids. And if you're a teacher, the way you raise other people's kids. It's a really cool topic and provides a lot of insight into your own mind as well, which is fun. So yeah, I love preschool, love teaching. I always will. And I'm really privileged to get opportunities to learn about how to best take care of the kids in my class and the kids that will be in my future classes. So I'm really, really grateful for that. So I'd just like to say quick shout out and thank you to my TA, Christian, and my professor, Dr. Jessica Remke, for the opportunities this semester to learn. Yeah, so, and another thank you to Tawny for coming on the podcast. She's going to be an awesome doctor of human development and family studies, and I can't wait to see what she does with her career. So thanks for listening to the Securely Wired podcast. I'm your lovely, securely attached host, Sydney Fox. Please remember to like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more preschool science content. Thanks, you guys. See you later.